What's going on with risk aversion and men not approaching women?
Sure. So risk aversion refers to a personality trait or disposition where individuals are basically more accepting or more willing to take risks. So high risk aversion would be individuals who are less willing to take risks. And a big risk for men, at least a perceived risk, is of course approaching women. So recently I conducted a survey and I used a measure of risk aversion and I asked about approach behavior, basically approaching for dates, approaching on the street, approaching in a bar, talking to someone at work or in class. And yeah, there's an inverse correlation, or I should say a positive correlation with that risk aversion and willingness to approach, right? That people who are more risk averse, much less willing to approach, they tend to have more fears as well, as far as the potential consequences of approaching a woman asking for a date.
What did they say were the primary fears that these guys were concerned about?
Sure. So some of the primary fears are basically social rejection and social consequences. There were some differences where individuals higher in risk aversion might fear more legal consequences as well, like some kind of report to HR, the police, or even something like that. But it tends to be mostly kind of a fear of like loss of reputation.
Yeah, well, I suppose, we have a basis for this ancestrally that if you were rebuffed by one of the women in your tribe, that probably wouldn't do much for your credibility with the rest of the women in the tribe and that your mates might take the piss out of you. So I certainly understand from that angle. For the women as well that are listening, the all-consuming fear as a guy of seeing a girl across the room and looking at her and thinking I should go and say hello because I think that she's nice is like fucking mortal. It's reality bending. It's so strange. It's such a bizarre. And again, I'm sure that there's loads of guys listening that I don't know what you're talking about. I can just go up and talk to anybody. But I think even the average normal risk aversion man has this pretty sort of guttural sense of trepidation before they go and do it.
Absolutely, yeah. And yeah, the most confident man, it doesn't matter. They're going to be a little bit nervous at least approaching a woman. And I think that's something in pickup artist communities that they've kind of caught on to is almost kind of an exposure therapy to that. Which, exposure therapy, when people have phobias, they're exposed gradually to whatever the stimulus is that reduces that fear. And so maybe they've kind of caught on like approach 100 women and you will be less afraid. Yeah, that's what it is. But of course, most men aren't out there approaching 100 women, and that kind of nervousness, it persists, even if an individual is very, very confident to begin with.
Yeah, I think that was definitely one of the positive sides of the pickup world was that it taught men to overcome approach anxiety just through exposure therapy, right? It gamified exposure therapy, which is pretty reliable when you're trying to get rid of all manner of phobias. If it's a spider that you're scared or you agoraphobia and you don't want to leave the house, it's one step at a time, very, very small exposures, etc. And given that this is such a difficult one, I asked. It was ages ago, but I spoke about what it's like for a woman to approach a man and be rejected, and had some really interesting responses from women that it's really painful for them because they almost feel like they've broken the social norm and still not succeeded. So there's kind of two layers of shame that they've had to go through, as opposed to, I guess, men maybe with only one.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't even look at women approaching men because it is so uncommon. Even for very attractive men, they just don't get approached that much. If a man gets approached once or twice a year, he's a Chad now, basically. That's what it is. It's super uncommon for men to get approached. And it is a violation of those expected gender roles in a way that, women will wait. And they will say, I would prefer to be approached by a man. And that's something else that kind of came out in the research. We asked women, uh, would you like to be approached more? And you had about 70 to 80% of women, particularly younger women, even more than older women, that said, yeah, I wish men would approach more, but they're not going to do it. The women aren't gonna approach men for sure.
Interesting. So, have you looked longitudinally at this? Do you know if men's risk aversion and fear of approach has increased over time?
I don't know for sure, but I think is some research on that I haven't done that's looked at risk aversion in younger generations, and they may be more risk averse. So it might be something that we see, particularly with the Zoomers, right, with the younger generation, that they are more risk averse than earlier generations. And there's a lot of kind of converging evidence on that. They're waiting later in life to take risks, like getting a job, going to school, getting a driver's license, many of these other things that would indicate, okay, they're kind of hesitant to enter the adult world, so to speak.
Yeah, Gene Twangi's work in Generations is fantastic with this slow life strategy or extended adolescence. It explains an awful lot. You know, me and Bus have been talking about this generalized risk aversion syndrome, and it's across. You know, it permeates absolutely everything, but it really, really shows up in dating because dating is largely a game of risk remediation, right? It's how can I kind of deal with the inevitable uncertainty of going up to someone. I don't know if they like me. I don't know if they're single. I don't know if I'm going to look silly. It very much is kind of like the vanguard of risk. I suppose other things, moving out of the house, changing jobs, moving locations, but certainly a much lower stakes, more common one, which is what makes it interesting because it is lower stakes. It's like, what, you get rejected by somebody when you go up to them? Like, there's literally no cost apart from a tiny little bit of discomfort. And yet, the felt sense of it is a world-ending catastrophe.
Exactly, yeah. And something kind of related to that is that we see, for example, individuals higher in the dark triad, they have more sexual partners, psychopaths as well, people that score high in the Hare psychopathy checklist. We see example, people that have a criminal record may have earlier sexual debuts, so they're having sex earlier in life or having more partners. And these are also all things that are associated with a higher tolerance for risk or even risk seeking. Individuals who might enjoy risk more. So it's kind of like, why do they have more partners or something like that? There's some indication that they might actually even select down. So it might not be that they're more attractive, but it could be that they're much more tolerant of risk or that they even seek risks out. So these are the people kind of approaching more aggressively. And so they're kind of reaping the fruits of that, so to speak.
Was it you that discovered 50% of men aged 18 to 30 haven't approached a woman in the last year?
Yes, that sounds right.
Dude.
Yeah.
I've been throwing that statistic all over the internet. So I'm glad that I got the citation right.
Yeah, and the men that have approached are doing remarkably well. A lot of the men who have approached, they more than half have gotten a date from it, and it goes down if you look to like long-term relationships, how many dates turn into a long-term relationship. But the men who are approaching, they're doing pretty well, actually.
Okay, so 50% of men aged 18 to 30 haven't approached a woman in the last year. Of that 50%, 50% of them did get a date.
I would have to check again, but it might even be higher. It might have been, of the men who had it, might have even been about 70%, at least got a date or a phone number or some kind of romantic connection there. And it goes down to about 20% that got a long-term relationship out of it. But sex is higher. So you kind of see it go down like date, sex is a little bit lower, long-term relationship is a little bit lower. But mostly they're kind of people that approach women, they're getting dates from it.
I don't know, that seems pretty positive for the approach. And I suppose, there's an argument to be made. Well, of course, the kind of guys that are approaching women, they're the ones that are full of the confidence, or they're the ones that know it's a sure thing. Of course, they're getting into relationships and having sex and going on dates and getting phone numbers and stuff. But given the fact that this is an exclusively agentic decision that you're making, right? Yeah, sure. If you have a little bit more confidence in yourself, it's going to make making the decision more easy. But ultimately, there's a huge chunk of people in that 50% that are doing it that probably are just as unsure and just as terrified and just as uncertain as you are. So, yeah, I mean, that's a serious white pill for why you should approach women.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the things that I've come to believe is that, as far as the whole PUA thing and all of that goes, yeah, like a lot of it just comes down to approaching women and it does seem to work. It's interesting you said agentic as well, because I have some more data. I haven't put it out yet, but this looks at like locus of control and dating difficulties. So I asked people to list all of these. What do they think are their difficulties in dating? And then I coded those into a survey, got the responses, and I found a correlation with locus of control and dating difficulty. So individuals that have a higher internal locus of control, that are more agentic, they tend to report that they have fewer difficulties dating. So that's another thing too, is that more agentic individuals in that sense, like you said, yeah, they're probably doing better.
Yeah, I think William Costello's most recent post about incels found a wildly externalized locus of control. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. His recent paper, exactly that. He looked at the same thing, locus of control, and incels had, that higher external locus of control. People with an external locus of control, they see the world as like things just happen to me. It's out of my control. Whereas people with an internal locus of control, they say, I make things happen. Things don't just happen to me. Whatever happens in life, I have some control over that.
This episode is brought to you by Shortform. Shortform is my absolute favorite way to discover new non-fiction books and gain deeper insights into books that I've already read. You guys know about how important my reading list is to me, and Shortform is an easier, faster, and cheaper way to dive into ideas that I've always been curious about. They're essentially book summaries on steroids. They provide super detailed guides of the book's key ideas, and they've got smart insights and interactive exercises. I really love using Shortform to revisit some of my all-time favorite books, like The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. They've got one-page summaries and breakdowns of each chapter that will help you to better absorb and solidify all of the learnings without having to go back through a book that you've already read. The best part is that they always keep their library fresh. Shortform drops new book guides and articles every week, and subscribers get to vote on what books to cover. You can try Shortform completely free for 5 days with no obligation by following the link in the description or by going to shortform.com/modernwisdom, and you'll get an additional 20% off if you sign up for the annual subscription. That's shortform.com/modernwisdom. What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe.